The year is 1595, and Sultan Murat III has just summoned you to his chambers. You're led through a maze of corridors by the chief black eunuch, knowing that this single night will determine your entire future. If you please the Sultan, you'll receive your own room, servants, and a salary. If you become pregnant with a son, you'll gain power beyond imagination. But if you fail to follow the complex bedroom protocols, or worse, if you're carrying another woman's perfume, you could be sewn into a sack and drowned in the Bosphorus. Welcome to the most dangerous bedroom in history. You know that the Ottoman Empire was one of the world's most powerful states for 600 years. But have you ever wondered what really happened in the harem at the heart of this empire? The rules that every woman entering the Sultan's bedroom had to follow were so complex that one wrong move could mean death. But why was no woman allowed to stay until morning beside the Sultan? Why was every sexual encounter of the Sultan officially recorded? And why was a concubine executed for selling her appointment slot? The truths you'll learn in this story will reveal the greatest secrets in Ottoman history. Before diving into this story, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Living in the Ottoman harem was a constant struggle for survival. Every concubine lived within a complex web of rules from dawn to dusk. A wrong look, a mistaken gesture, or an inappropriate word could bring about a concubine's end. The first rule was absolute silence. Concubines could never talk about the Sultan. Even if the Sultan's name came up among themselves, this was considered a grave crime. The second rule was perfect cleanliness. Every concubine had to bathe at least twice a day and be constantly perfumed and clean. The third, and perhaps most important rule, was being in constant competition with other concubines. Because there was no friendship in the harem, only the struggle to capture the Sultan's attention. This struggle was so intense that concubines would attempt to poison each other, tie spells to hair strands, or secretly engage in sabotage. Before being taken to the Sultan's bedroom, concubines received special training that lasted for years. This training wasn't just about dance and music. This education program, called the erotic arts, taught the concubine every way to please the Sultan. The most ruthless part was giving the concubine the task of enchanting the Sultan so much that he would never think of another woman. For this, some concubines even resorted to methods considered witchcraft. They would drink special mixtures, carry talismans, and perform mysterious rituals. In the harem, the greatest enemies were other concubines. There was ruthless competition among concubines to capture the Sultan's attention. This competition went so far that some concubines would even commit murder to eliminate their rivals. For example, a woman who was the Sultan's favorite concubine was poisoned by her rival. Investigation revealed that the poisoner had mixed a special herb into her rival's food. The punishment? Both the poisoner and all the concubines who helped her were executed. In another case, jealousy between two concubines turned into a fight in the Sultan's presence. The two women began pulling each other's hair and scratching each other with their nails, fighting in front of the Sultan. The Sultan was so angry at this situation that he immediately executed both concubines. There was a secret communication system among concubines in the harem. Because open speaking was forbidden, but information sharing was necessary for survival, concubines used special signs to warn each other about the Sultan's mood. For instance, if the Sultan was angry, the informed concubine would touch her hair with her hand. If the Sultan was happy, she would pretend to adjust her dress. If the Sultan was sick or tired, she would scratch her nose. Concubines who knew these signs would adjust their behavior accordingly. The most dangerous sign was the one indicating that the Sultan had grown tired of a concubine. In this case, other concubines would stay away from that woman and avoid any relationship with her. Because talking to a concubine who had fallen from the Sultan's favor meant preparing their own end. The nights spent in the Sultan's bedroom weren't just sexual encounters. These nights were filled with special rituals that the concubine used to increase her influence over the sultan. Some concubines would recite special prayers and burn talismans before entering the sultan's bed. Others would use mysterious perfumes and apply special oils to their bodies to enchant the sultan. Some concubines would even dance in the bedroom to capture the sultan's attention. The most interesting ritual was the dream-telling ritual. When the concubine woke up beside the sultan, she would claim to tell him special dreams. These dreams usually told of the sultan's great victories, Allah's protection of the sultan, or the concubine's love for the sultan. These rituals were so widespread that the chief black eunuch would conduct a special inspection before taking the concubine to the sultan. He would check if the concubine carried talismans, strange smells, or hid odd things. If anything suspicious was found, the concubine would be immediately executed. Our story begins with an ordinary concubine being chosen by the chief black eunuch to be presented to the sultan. This selection wasn't random. The sultan's mood that day, political situations, even astrological calculations could influence this decision. The chosen concubine would first go through a special preparation process. First, she would be bathed in a special bathhouse, perfumed with the most expensive fragrances, and dressed in silk clothes. But beware, carrying another woman's perfume meant death. Every detail was checked, and the concubine was completely sterilized before being presented to the sultan. One of the most important rules of the Ottoman harem was the one woman, one son policy. What did this mean? If a concubine became pregnant by the sultan and gave birth to a male child, she could never again enter the sultan's bed. Why? Because the Ottoman throne system was based on an open succession model. Every prince could claim the throne, and this led to deadly struggles between brothers. If a woman had more than one son, these children would fight for the same mother, causing civil war within the dynasty. This rule was so strict that even the sultan couldn't break it if he wanted to. Until Suleiman the Magnificent came along, he broke this rule for Hurrem Sultan and created one of history's greatest scandals. Now, let's return to that terrible night. The concubine was led to the sultan's bedroom by the chief black eunuch. Even entering this room required complex protocol. First, the concubine would enter from the foot of the bed. She would crawl forward and kiss the sultan's feet. Speaking was forbidden. She couldn't say a single word until the sultan gave her permission. If the sultan didn't want to be intimate with the concubine that night, she would silently withdraw and never be called again. But if the sultan wanted to be intimate with the concubine, then the real rules would come into play. The concubine had to do everything to impress the sultan, please him, and most importantly, become pregnant. Because becoming pregnant was the only way to rise in the harem. Isn't it surprising? Before moving on to the parts that will surprise you even more, I want to ask a question. Would you like to live in a palace during the Ottoman period? I'm looking forward to your comment. If you like our content, please subscribe to our channel and support us. Now, let's continue our historical journey. The most important rule was this: no woman could stay in the sultan's bedroom until morning. Before sunrise, the concubine would be removed from the room and sent to her own quarters. This rule was so strict that it had never been broken for centuries. Until Hurrem Sultan. She stayed beside Suleiman until morning. This incident created a great shock in the harem, and gossip continued for months, because everyone knew that breaking this rule required a death sentence. Perhaps one of the most shocking details was that every sexual encounter of the sultan was recorded in official records. A palace official called the treasurer recorded which day he was with which woman in a special diary. These records weren't kept just out of curiosity. If a concubine became pregnant, the father and birth date of the child had to be accurately determined, because this child could be a potential heir. This diary was so detailed that which concubine was with the sultan on which night, how long this intimacy lasted, and even the sultan's mood that night were recorded. One of the greatest scandals in the harem occurred during Suleiman's reign. A concubine named Gulfem Kadın was executed for selling her turn to be with the sultan to another concubine. This incident shows how strict the rules in the harem were. The appointment turn was considered sacred, and selling this turn meant deceiving the Sultan. The punishment was death. If the concubine became pregnant, her life would completely change. The moment the pregnancy test was positive, the concubine would be given a special room, her servants would be increased, and her salary would be raised, because she had now become the mother of a potential prince. But here the second great rule would come into play. If the child born was male, the concubine's sexual relationship with the Sultan would end. She would dedicate the rest of her life to her son's education and protection. She was no longer the Sultan's concubine, but the mother of a prince. If the child born was female, the concubine could be called to the Sultan's bed again. Because girls posed no threat to the throne, only sons were needed. The chief black eunuch was the only male figure in the harem. Due to being a eunuch, one of his most important duties was managing the Sultan's bedroom protocols. He would decide which concubine would be presented to the Sultan on which night, manage the necessary preparations, and punish if a concubine didn't follow the rules. He even had the authority to send a concubine to execution when necessary. The chief black eunuch was also the Sultan's closest confidant. He would report to him about what was happening in the harem and evaluate political situations. Therefore, the chief black eunuch often became the empire's second most powerful person after the Sultan. During Sultan Ibrahim's reign, bedroom rules became even more absurd. Ibrahim was a sultan with excessive sexual desires and violated traditional protocols. He began being intimate with multiple concubines simultaneously. Some sources even suggest he organized rituals resembling group sex. This was unprecedented in Ottoman tradition and created great chaos in the harem. Ibrahim's behavior eventually led to statesmen removing him from the throne. Because the Sultan's sexual life wasn't just a personal matter, but a state matter. There were various punishments for concubines who didn't follow the rules in the harem. The mildest punishment was the concubine falling from grace and never being presented to the Sultan again. Medium-level punishments included beatings or imprisonment, but for serious crimes, there was only one punishment: death. And even this death required a special ritual. The guilty concubine would be sewn into a sack and thrown into the Bosphorus. This practice was considered compliant with Islamic law to prevent bloodshed. The power to enforce all these rules in the harem belonged to the Valide Sultan. The Valide Sultan, who was the Sultan's mother, had a power that no man in the harem possessed. She would decide which concubine would be presented to the Sultan, determine bedroom protocols, and make life and death decisions over concubines when necessary. The Valide Sultan's word was as powerful as the Sultan's own command. But the Valide Sultan's power wasn't limited to the harem alone. She could also influence state policies. When determining which concubine would be presented to the Sultan, she would consider which country that concubine came from, what religion she believed in, and who her family was. For example, if the Ottoman Empire was at war with Russia, Russian concubines wouldn't be presented to the Sultan, because the Sultan falling in love with that concubine and having children with her could create political problems. The Valide Sultan's greatest fear was the Sultan falling in love with a concubine and marrying her, because a married concubine could rival the Valide Sultan's power. Therefore, the Valide Sultan would try to prevent the Sultan from getting too close to any concubine. There were at least 5 major harem rebellions recorded in history, but not widely known. These rebellions usually stemmed from injustice among concubines. The biggest rebellion occurred during Sultan Ahmed's reign. About 50 concubines went on a collective hunger strike to protest the Sultan only being interested in a few favorite concubines. This rebellion grew so large that even the Sultan had to intervene. The rebelling concubines appeared before the Sultan and voiced their complaints. The Sultan was initially very angry, but after listening to the concubines' justified reasons, he made some changes to harem rules. Another rebellion protested the hierarchical system among concubines. Young new concubines complained that they were constantly oppressed by older concubines and treated like servants. This rebellion was also successful, and adjustments were made to harem rules. The greatest fear in the harem was disease, because sick concubines couldn't be presented to the Sultan, which meant they would fall from grace. Concubines would experience fear at the slightest sign of illness. Fever, cough, skin disease, even bad breath could bring about a concubine's end. Therefore, there was constant health monitoring in the harem. Every morning, special doctors would examine the concubines. Sick concubines would immediately be taken to separate sections and treated. But during the treatment process, those concubines couldn't be presented to the Sultan. The most terrible disease was contagious diseases. If plague, cholera, or other contagious diseases broke out in the harem, the entire harem would be quarantined. In this situation, no concubine could be presented to the Sultan, and in some cases, sick concubines would be immediately killed. What happened to concubines when they aged? The answer to this question was also quite complex. Concubines who had children from the Sultan had guaranteed lives because their sons were princes. But for concubines who didn't have children, old age meant disaster. These concubines were usually assigned to cleaning duties in the harem, or used for training young concubines. Some were sent to the old palace and spent the rest of their lives there. The luckiest old concubines were married to wealthy men outside the palace. These marriages provided the concubine with freedom and a secure life, but this opportunity was granted to very few concubines. While these rules seem absurd today, they made sense for their time, because the Ottoman Empire was built on dynasty, and succession was vital. Every sexual encounter could produce a potential heir. Therefore, the Sultan's bedroom was used not just for personal pleasure, but for state governance. Every concubine was an instrument that could shape the empire's future. But when evaluating this entire system, we must also consider the understanding of women's rights of that era. In the 16th and 17th centuries, women weren't free anywhere in the world. In fact, in some respects, harem concubines had more rights and freedoms than ordinary women in Europe. The Ottoman harem bedroom was history's most complex, most dangerous, and most political bedroom. The decisions made here were vital not only for concubines, but for the entire empire. These rules were applied for 600 years and formed the foundation of the Ottoman Empire's power. But at the same time, they darkened the lives of thousands of women and treated them like commodities. When we hear these stories today, we realize how far we've come in women's rights in our modern world. But at the same time, when we try to understand the logic of that era, we see how complex systems governed powerful empires. What do you think? Were these rules logical for their time, or were they just violations of women's rights? I'm waiting for your comments, and if you enjoy discovering such historical secrets, don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, because every week we'll continue to discover new stories in the dark corridors of history.